Hello and welcome to BattleTech Faction Briefings. Today, we return to the Federated Suns to look at the first regiment developed specifically for the Federated Commonwealth. They have been called the Guardians of the New Order. They survived the FedCom Civil War, but unfortunately they have a tragic end. We are looking at the first Federated Commonwealth RCT, aka the first Federated Suns Lancers. Originally, the insignia was a circle divided into two sections. On the right was the Davian Sword and Sunburst, and on the left was the Steiner Mailed Fist. When the Federated Commonwealth was fully established, the insignia was made up of a circle featuring the Davian Sword and Sunburst with the Steiner Mailed Fist. At that time, the regimental symbol was a dragon clutching a sword flanked by two lightning bolts, and a dragon ball to represent the unit number. After the division of the Federated Commonwealth, they removed all symbols connected with the Lyran Alliance. The Federated Suns Lancers use a lance over the Sunburst shield in place of the sword. Their unit colors are navy blue with gold stripes on the arms and legs, and occasional usage of gold on the torso. Their armor and cavalry units use gold on their turrets and gold on some armor plates, creating an almost chessboard-like pattern on the vehicles. In the Dark Age, the gold is sometimes replaced with gray. The history of the first Federated Commonwealth Regiment is closely tied to the history of the Federated Commonwealth. If you want to skip spoilers, then go to the time listed. In 3028, Melissa Steiner married Hans Davian. As a wedding gift, Melissa gave Hans a regiment of Valkyries, Enforcers, and Griffins. The idea was to create a unit that would represent the union of the Lyran Commonwealth and Federated Suns. The unit would be made up of the top graduates from the NAIS and Albion Academies of the Federated Suns, along with the top graduates of the Nagelring Academy of the Lyran Commonwealth. They were a green unit with no experience, so they were kept far from the front lines and stationed on New Avalon. They would be moved to Clethandu 4 in late August 3029. Clethandu had been under attack by the 9th Benjamin Regulars since November 3028. The world had held out due to the tenacity of the local militia that had only conventional forces. Then, in early August 3029, the Rahman Draconis March militia arrived to help relieve the worn-down local forces. They were able to break the Combine siege at great cost. The first FedCom was brought in near the end of the month to provide support for the final push. The first FedCom would be on rear guard duty. They would have minor encounters with the 9th Benjamin Regulars that would boost the confidence of the new unit. However, the 1st Battalion took on the 9th's 3rd Battalion with disastrous results. Despite the losses, the 1st FedCom kept pushing forward, but DCMS reinforcements would arrive and the AFFS troops had to withdraw from the world. Their efforts were enough of a distraction to slow down the Combine advance, limiting the amount of worlds taken by the Dragon. After the war, the development of new FedCom units became a priority. The original commander of the 1st, James Sandoval, would become the commander of the FedCom Corps. The units of the Corps would be built up to show the strength of the two nations. The 1st would get moved to Gond Singh as their new garrison on the Capellan border. This was a boon to Gond Singh as it increased tourism due to people wanting to see the 1st Combined Nations Regiment. Prior to the war, the 1st FedCom Regiment was expanded into a regimental combat team, making them a bigger threat than the standard regimental formations. The battle-tested 1st FedCom would be sent to Nashira on May 1st. They would be teamed up with the 12th Vegan Rangers Delta Regiment. The mercenaries would take the lead in the operation and suggest an orbital drop near a major city. The leaders of both regiments would argue about the strategy. The final agreement led to the 1st Battalion of the Rangers dropping to secure an LZ, while the 1st FedCom would do a traditional landing. The Rangers were set upon by the local militia, made up of conventional forces. The enemy ambush was easily dealt with. This gave the leadership of the 1st FedCom confidence when planning the assault on the world. Nashira was once the base of the Genyosha, who had been moved in previous years. However, the local forces were inspired by the elite skill of the Genyosha and used an aggressive military doctrine when defending their world. When the first landed, the local militia not only used conventional forces, but kamikaze attacks, explosive traps, and guerrilla tactics. This led to a drawn-out battle to take their objective, which ended with the loss of 8 mechs, 2 companies of armor, and 200 infantry soldiers. This debacle led to the removal of Marshal Myra Tran as the leader of the first FedCom RCT, and her XO would take command. By May 21st, they were able to capture Logan City, the capital of Nashira. However, they were put upon by guerrilla forces for months. Due to communications problems, no relief or reinforcements were sent, leaving the 2 regiments to stay on world and deal with guerrillas and angry locals. To make matters worse, the 1st and 2nd Genyosha arrived in July. The FedCom forces were scattered, dealing with various local problems. The concentrated power of the Genyosha made quick work of these small units. The 1st FedCom would retreat into Logan City and prepare for a siege. The Rangers and 1st FedCom held off the Genyosha, but the hit-and-run strikes of the samurai chipped away at their forces. In September, a chemical weapon attack devastated the 1st FedCom RCT. In response, the Genyosha attacked the guerrillas due to their dishonorable actions. By the end of October, the FedCom forces were given withdrawal orders. The FedCom forces wanted to keep fighting, but were denied. Many members of the Vegan Rangers and 1st FedCom would hold grudges against the DCMS for years to come. The 1st would return to their garrison on Gansing to rebuild after the war. In 3042, the world of Gansing was raided by FWLM troops as a probing attack. They were repelled with assistance from famed war hero Andrew Redburn and his forces. This would prevent further probes and show that the 1st FedCom had grown stronger despite not being at full power. It took time for the 1st FedCom RCT to rebuild, but when they did, they were considered a veteran unit. They remained on Gansing to protect the border during the early stages of the clan invasion. After the ceasefire was declared in 3052, the FedCom Corps would be expanded in preparation for further conflicts. By 3055, the Corps would be made up of 12 RCTs. Operation Guerrero would come in 3057. It hit the world of Gansing with ferocity. The 1st FedCom were not ready for the assault, and they could not coordinate a defense with the 3rd Donegal Guards, who were also on world. The FedCom forces had to retreat to the world of Nanking. The evacuation was very disorganized, and many soldiers from the 1st FedCom and 3rd Donegal were left behind. They would team up with Capellan soldiers and some local fighters who had been abandoned in the Chaos March. This odd group would end up forming the Pandora's Box Mercenaries. The 1st FedCom would continue to fight as they did many raids into the Chaos March to try to reclaim lost worlds. However, after Operation Guerrero, the Federated Commonwealth split and the Lyran Alliance was created. The FedCom RCTs that were in the Alliance were disbanded, and their resources were added to other Lyran forces. This would be the first sign of the coming storm. By the beginning of the 3060s, the 1st FedCom had 2 battalions down for repairs and refit. By the time they were brought back into action, they had top-of-the-line equipment from GM. However, the cost for this new equipment was to join in on Operation Stiletto. This was a mission funded by GM to take back the worlds of Akamar and Genoa. The 1st wasn't officially allowed to join the fight against pirates, warlords, and the madness of the Chaos March. Thus, they secretly took the mission and succeeded in order to upgrade their own equipment. As the Civil War broke out, the 1st Federated Commonwealth RCT was still stationed on Nanking. They chose to not take sides in the early stages of the conflict. However, the Nanking Sarna March Militia started moving towards important objectives. The 1st FedCom defended the Talon Industries Factory, the AFFC Command Center, and the planetary capital of Yangkou. They tried to keep the Nanking Sarna March Militia under control, but terrorist attacks allowed them to break away from the 1st FedCom's hold. This led to a chase, where the 1st got assistance from the Kestrel Grenadiers to stop the rogue unit. After 5 days of fighting, the Nanking SMM surrendered. For the rest of the war, the 1st would spend their time defending Nanking from Capellan-sponsored attacks and local revolts. Thus, they took far less damage than some of the other units that got heavily involved in the Civil War. By the end of the war, the 12 FedCom RCTs no longer existed. 5 had been absorbed into the Lyran Alliance, 2 were absorbed by the Federated Suns, and 4 were destroyed. The only unit to survive intact was the 1st FedCom RCT. They would get renamed and made part of the AFFS. In late 3067, the 1st FedCom RCT would become the 1st Federated Suns Lancers. George Hasek would plan an attack on the Capellan Confederation in 3068. It was called Operation Sovereign Justice. The 1st would join in on Operation Sovereign Justice and would work with the 1st Kittery Borderers to attack Gifu. Their combined might shattered the 3rd Capellan Defense Force, ending them as a unit. Of note, the 1st Federated Suns Lancers left their conventional forces behind to guard Nanking. The Ward of Blake would attack Nanking, and the conventional forces fought alongside the 1st Crucius Lancers to protect the world. The Blake forces would win, but anti-Blake rebels would fight back for years to come. Operation Sovereign Justice would continue, with the 1st FedSuns Lancers attacking and securing Overton. They would hold Overton as the operation continued. The 1st would be pushed off the world in October 68, when the 15th Dracon and Warrior House Ijori attacked Overton. The Capellan counterattack was intense, and the 1st Federated Suns Lancers would retreat to Sashut at 50% effective in 3069. Shortly after that, the Ward of Blake arrived to capture the world of Sashut. It is unclear if the 1st evacuated or if they were defeated and captured until the world was liberated in 3072 by Stone's coalition. Either way, they were able to rebuild, and in 3077 they would join Stone's coalition to take down the Ward of Blake. They would work as part of Group 3 in the Lyran Alliance. They would get thrashed in a battle on Gakrus. The Ward of Blake would target and kill the leadership of the 1st FedSuns, 6th Benjamin Regulars, and 31st Merrick Militia. It would take time for new leadership to take command, but Group 3 would continue to push against the Ward of Blake and liberate the world in May of 77. Their next move was to attack Wing. The world of Wing was protected by the 3rd Free World's Guards, who would deal heavy damage to the 6th Benjamin Regulars due to the 1st FedSuns not assisting them. After several weeks of fighting, the 3rd Free World's Guards would abandon the world and would flee to the Principality of Regulus. In 3078, Group 3 would be involved in the fighting on New Earth. The 1st worked with the Sky Guards and 17th Arcturan Guards, as well as several galaxies of clan forces. The coalition forces had difficulty working alongside the clanners during the attack, and the operation slowed down to a crawl. Things got so chaotic that Stone's coalition moved on to Terra and left the clan forces behind to fight on New Earth. Group 3 would join in on the liberation of Terra. The 1st FedSuns were part of the team that was sent to assault Sydney. They would fight until the end of the war. They took heavy damage during the fighting, leaving them with 1 battalion of mechs. They would go to Ozawa to rebuild into a light combat team in 3079. The 1st Federated Suns Lancers would leave Ozawa when it was brought into the Republic of the Sphere. In 3081, they would be stationed on the world of Lee. Once again, they would be a key unit in the defense of the Capellan border. The 1st Federated Suns Lancers would be one of the most respected units in the AFFS after the Ward of Blake War. They would be hunting pirates and other raiders in 3085. Many of the pirates had Capellan equipment, and that made the Federated Suns very suspicious of their neighbor. As the Dark Age continued, the 1st would also defend the border from Capellan attacks. The Federated Suns would take steps to improve the defenses of their nation in 3132. The Federated Suns Lancers would be expanded with 3 new commands, creating 4 regiments of Federated Suns Lancers. All 4 units would see action protecting the border against the Draconis Combine and Capellan Confederation, as both nations would invade during the later half of the Dark Age. In 3144, Caleb Davian would bring his forces together on Palmyra for an assault on the worlds held by the Draconis Combine, who had been taking worlds from the Federated Suns for nearly a decade at this point, while Caleb was distracted and made terrible decisions. The DCMS struck first, which led to the destruction of many AFFS units and ended the life of First Prince Caleb Davian. Sadly, during the fighting on Palmyra, the 7th New Samarkand Regulars would attack the 1st Federated Suns Lancers. Things would not go well, and when the battle ended, the 1st Federated Suns Lancers were destroyed. It is possible that some survivors of the 1st joined the other survivors of shattered AFFS regiments to become a guerrilla army that battled against the occupation forces for several years. As for the other units in the Federated Suns Lancers, the 4th would fight on Tikhonov in 3143 and would destroy Burr's Black Cobras at great cost. After the battle, they had to pull back to rebuild. The 2nd would be defeated by the 2nd Regiment of McCarran's Armored Cavalry on New Hessen in 3144. The 3rd would be nearly destroyed while fighting on Tikhonov against the 5th Cyan Dragoons in 3145. The remains of the 3rd would be used to help rebuild the 2nd and the 4th. Things may be grim, but the Federated Suns Lancers are still holding out in what remains of the Federated Suns. The origins of the 1st FedCom Regiment had a big impact on the AFFC, as the FedCom Corps became a major force over the decades. However, the Civil War would shatter that legacy. The Federated Suns Lancers were able to secure enough fame to allow for more regiments. Despite being destroyed, their sibling units still survive and defend the Federated Suns as the Ill Clan era begins. There are not many notable pilots in the 1st FedCom RCT, despite their important history. James Sandoval, a nobleman who would serve with the 1st Robinson Rangers. Then in 3022, he would become an NAIS instructor. He would command the Draconis March forces in 3026 and take command of the 1st FedCom Regiment in 3028. He would be promoted to the commander of the FedCom Corps in 3038 and would die in 3066 of natural causes. He piloted a Zeus. Vonda de Greer, a commander of the Mayetta Draconis March Militia, who would later become the XO of the 1st and would take command in 39 when the commander was removed for incompetence. Vonda would hold this position until 3057. Her fate is unclear, but it is likely that she died during the fierce fighting of Operation Guerrero. Allie Swanson. She took command after de Greer and would take time to rebuild the 1st FedCom, including increasing their training standards. She was not a popular commander, but carried the unit through the Civil War, and she would retire as the 1st FedCom was reformed. Dixon Ziebler. He was a mech regimental commander of the 1st FedCom RCT around 3060 and would become the commander of the 1st when they were rebuilt into the 1st Federated Suns Lancers. He would see the unit through the Word of Blake War and keep them together as they rebuilt in the early Dark Age. The 1st FedCom Regiment has a variety of forms over the decades, and that will alter their TO&E. Initially, they are made up of Valkyries, Enforcers, and Griffins, which makes it a medium-weight unit. As their history continued, they seem to have added in more heavy and possibly assault mechs. However, the upgraded units from the early 3060s were medium and light units. Thus, the 1st is generally a medium-weight unit. The 1st uses small unit tactics, with none of the teams being larger than a battalion. Each of the battalions seems to have similar builds, and they all move fast enough so they can relieve each other with limited delay during battle. This allows them to be far more tenacious than most units of comparable size. As a regimental combat team, they had a regiment of battle mechs, 3 regiments of combat vehicles, 5 regiments of infantry, 2 wings of aero fighters, and a battalion of artillery. Each regiment of armor had a different job, with a recon team, a medium cavalry team, and a heavy team. Their infantry had standard, jump, and mechanized forces with battle armor after the 3060s. Later, the 1st would become a light combat team, made up of a reinforced battalion of mechs, 2 to 3 battalions of heavy and assault armor, with an equal number of armored cavalry, an artillery company, and a regiment or less of battle armor with engineering and VTOL support. Bear in mind, when building a team of the 1st, from any point in its history, they will primarily use a mix of Lyran and Federated Suns gear. After the Civil War, they will rely on Federated Suns tech and units produced by GM. No matter the era, they tend to be focused on speed and power over armor, giving them a distinctive style. There is no point of view fiction for the 1st in any of their forms, but the 1st FedCom RCT is referenced in a short story. Beyond that, any manual that ties into the Federated Suns will have some information about the unit, filling in a good amount of their history. However, some books only have formation and location data. I will admit, I chose this unit on a whim. I was curious about the FedCom Corps and chose the 1st as it seemed like the most appropriate starting point for the command. I found the history of the unit quite interesting, and I was surprised at how often they took a beating. I expected them to be nearly invincible, like the unbeatable Hans Davian, who started a war over a clone. I mean, he wanted to give his wife a kingdom, and it had nothing to do with his petty vendettas. Otherwise, his statement about the gift would just be gaslighting for his very young wife. If you haven't noticed, the Warrior Trilogy's ending has somewhat altered my beliefs about Hans Davian, and now I am thoroughly under the belief that Hans was a He enjoys combing his wife's hair. No wonder their kids are so messed up. If you want to build the 1st FedCom for the tabletop, it's not a bad choice. They have a long history and fight every enemy of the Federated Suns at least once. Plus, their colors work for all members of the Federated Suns Lancers, for those of you who enjoy Dark Age and Ill-Clan era games. Next time, I will be looking at Brian's Legion. Then, in March, I will be focusing on the Draconis Combine by discussing the 36th Dairon Regulars before discussing another mercenary unit. If you have suggestions, let me know in the comments. A big thank you to all my viewers. I'm closing in on 1,000 subscribers, and that makes me so hyped for making new videos. May your weapons stay hot and your reactors stay cool. Until next time, please check out the BattleTech Faction Briefing playlist, and I'll see you at the tavern.